Some of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with the name John Snow, particularly if you're familiar with history and medicine, or even better, the history of medicine. John Snow was a Victorian doctor who, in the 1850s, investigated the cholera outbreak in Soho, London. And he mapped out where most of the victims' houses were and saw that they were clustered around one particular water pump in Broad Street. So he just went out and he took the handle off and the epidemic was over. And this led him to conclude that cholera was a waterborne disease, not an airborne disease, as was currently believed, had been believed for years. And in one fell swoop, really, he invented both epidemiology and germ theory. And he is now, rightly idolised for both of these things. What is less well known about John Snow is that the medical establishment largely reviled him in his own lifetime. The editor of The Lancet had a particular vendetta against him. And this was for a couple of reasons. I mean, fundamentally, it was because the consensus at the time was that miasma theory was all important. Miasma theory, to put it very simply, is that diseases spread through bad smells. And they believed that cholera was spread this way. And they were set on closing down a whole range of polluting industries, in London in particular, on the basis that it was spreading cholera through rotting meat, rotting vegetables, this kind of thing. And so they attacked Snow on two grounds, really. I mean, they, in so many words, portrayed him as being a crank, and they also portrayed him as being a hired gun of business. In terms of his theory itself, The Lancet, in a couple of very sarcastic and visceral editorials, called what we now know to be germ theory a mockery of science and a wretched crudity. The Lancet asserted the dominance of the existing consensus, saying that the belief that cholera was a waterborne disease was not, quote, in accordance with the experience of men who have studied the question without being blinded by theories. On the topic of him being a hired gun, well, in a way he was. Snow found common cause with some of the threatened industries at the time, who were appealing against a bill that was about to go through Parliament, which was going to cut down on polluting industries in the cities. And there was a financial relationship. They did pay Snow to testify for them at a parliamentary committee. It would be wrong to say that Snow was in favour of these industries per se. He was using the issue really just to promote germ theory. And indeed, he said in this parliamentary committee that you can close these industries down to say you're doing it because they're a nuisance. You don't need to drag science and medicine through the mud to do so. And ultimately, neither his links with supposedly vested interests nor the fact that the establishment disagreed with him stopped Snow from being right and the establishment being wrong. Now, my point here is not that the Lancet and medical establishment were fools. It's self-evidently true that any revolutionary idea is going to challenge a consensus. And, by the way, that also means that appealing to consensus is not a rational way to respond to revolutionary views. But the science was ultimately self-correcting. Miasma theory was ditched, germ theory was adopted, and Snow is now regarded to be a hero. The point I'm trying to make is that Snow's idea, Snow's heresy, was not addressed at the time by coolly assessing the evidence, and he'd gathered some fairly impressive evidence together for this, but by merely appealing to authority, appealing to consensus, and dismissing Snow as being a tool of big business. And yet, for all Snow's problems, he got a relatively early ride compared to some of the people who come up with contrarian views or produce contrarian evidence today. Take, for example, Catherine Flegel, who is a statistician at America's Centers for Disease Controls. Early last year, she published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which was a systematic review of 97 studies that had been done on obesity and disease. And what she found from amassing the evidence in a meta-analysis is that there wasn't an additional mortality risk until people were really quite obese. She found with people who were merely mildly obese, there was no added mortality risk, and people who were merely overweight, if anything, there was a slight decrease, or a slight reduction in mortality risk. And this had obviously been shown in studies before, because she was looking at the existing evidence, and it was not unknown to people who were familiar with the literature. Nevertheless, she and the study and her colleagues were savaged by the public health lobby How did they do so? Let's look at several tactics here. Tactic one, bold assertion and appeal to authority. So Walter Willett, one of the world's most prominent anti-obesity campaigners, said, "This study is really a pile of rubbish and no one should waste their time reading it." So kind of route one approach to debunking someone's work. Tactic two, a sort of appeal to ignorance. The Royal College of Physicians in the UK said, "Have you ever seen a 100-year-old human being who is overweight? The answer is you probably haven't." This is a sort of inverted version of the old, "My granddad lived to 102 and he ate nothing but chips and smoked 60 a day," you know. Tactic three, putting the public health message before the facts. So a spokesman for the National Obesity Forum said, "It's a horrific message to put out at this particular time." Tactic four, the same spokesman used a combination of misrepresentation and reductio ad absurdum by saying, "We shouldn't take it for granted that we can cancel the gym and that we can eat ourselves to death with Black Forest Gatto," which, again, was not really the conclusion of the study. And as a result of this barrage of abuse, really, which came from the moment the embargo was lifted on the study, it was the rebuttal, it was the attack that became the news story, rather than the findings of this study itself, a study that was transparently honest and conducted with someone who clearly had no vested interests. And later on last year, a symposium was organised by Walter Willett, in which more than 200 people filled an auditorium, and one researcher after another stepped onto the stage to denounce Flegel and her work. I'll take another example of Jim Enstrom, who had been working at UCLA since 1976, had helped write the 1983 Surgeon General's report on smoking and health, and an unblemished record, until two things happened a few years ago, which destroyed his career to all intents and purposes. Firstly, he and a colleague published a study in the British Medical Journal in 2003, which looked at a large database run right back to the 1950s, collated by the American Cancer Society, and they found no association between secondhand smoke and lung cancer when you've compared people who lived with smokers or were married to smokers and people who didn't. Again, this wasn't a new finding. There were plenty of studies that failed to find a relationship before. Of course, some also had. But again, the evidence was not merely coolly assessed. On the contrary, a group of anti-smoking campaigners, as soon as they heard about this study, they broke the embargo on the journal. They hastily organised a press conference in Florida in which they slated the study, a study that they had not even read yet. They'd only heard about the findings. Stanton Glantz, who also works at one of the Californian universities and who is a veteran anti-smoking campaigner, appeared on the radio to say that the study was, quote, crap, and that Enstrom was a damn fool. And again, the rebuttal rather than the findings of the study made the news. And the editor of the BMJ later noted that he said it was disturbing that so few people made criticisms and said there were flaws in the study without actually specifying what they were. And he said that the passion of the debate was far more notable than the precision of it. 2 years later, Enstrom then further blotted his copybook when he conducted some research on air pollution, particulate matter, diesel fumes in particular. Essentially, the findings showed that there was no prospect at risk at a level quite a long way above what the Californian Environmental Protection Agency was calling for with the new air pollution law. Again, studies have come out subsequently that confirmed those findings, and the Californian EPA simply ignored them in favour of a study conducted by somebody who, it turned out, bought their PhD from an online university for $1,000, something that Californian EPA still accepts and yet still rely on. Enstrom, meanwhile, was sacked in 2010 from UCLA after 35 years, after being told that, and I quote, his research is not aligned with the department's mission. And as a final example, this one you may be familiar with already, the study that came out in 2011 showing that, or claiming at least, that sugar consumption has been going down for decades in Australia while obesity has been going up. And the implication is that sugar consumption is not a necessary or sufficient cause of the obesity epidemic. Again, a study that if there are flaws in it, you would simply publish your own study in response. Instead, there's been a visceral attack on both the scientists involved with it, which led ultimately to a complaint being made at Sydney University, and they were investigated for scientific misconduct, of which they were only cleared last month. Now, the point of what I'm trying to say with these examples is that we needn't go into the rights and wrongs of the particular findings. Suffice to say that the people involved were all of good standing and were writing in peer-reviewed journals, which I accept is not a guarantee of veracity, but we're dealing with work that seems to be, at the very least, transparently honest. And it's hard to believe that any of these studies would have brought down such a firestorm had they not been dealing with red-button issues about which public health campaigners feel very strongly about. So if you look at the 1850s, when snow was attacked, the doctors were committed to making the cities smell better, which is a perfectly noble cause, but they were using miasma theory rather than just saying, we don't like the smell of these factories. 10 years ago, medical establishment was committed to smoking bans, and therefore the BMJ study was seen as, at the very least, inconvenient. Currently, they're committed to a war on obesity in which the demonization of sugar seems to be central, and any suggestion that being a little bit chubby might not actually be that bad for you is seen as blurring the message, and the message, of course, is all important. For these issues, to be blunt, the policies have already been decided. It's a combination of restricting or banning advertising, raising the prices, reformulating food, and so on. It's only really the details that are subject to any serious discussion within the public health movement. And they do want to send out a clear, unambiguous message to the public and to the politicians. And they particularly want the politicians to believe that there is not just a consensus, but a unanimity of opinion about these issues. And therefore, anything that comes along, and bear in mind, we're not talking about eccentric, grit in the oyster here. We're not talking about wackos and cranks. We're talking about people, who are professors within their own field, and the field is public health. So ask yourself a question. Does this sort of intimidation and harassment make it more or less likely that people in the field will publish findings that are at odds with the current consensus? Does it make it more or less likely that good researchers will be drawn into the field? Or does it make it more likely that politically motivated partisan campaigners will be drawn into the field while the others depart? And if that happens, and I put these questions to you as essentially rhetorical questions, I think all of those things are more likely to happen. If that happens, will it make the science that comes out of that particular field more or less reliable in the long run, and indeed the short and medium run? So in closing, I would say that groupthink and dogma, and I've used one example for one particular discipline, but I'm sure that there are plenty of other examples. Groupthink and dogma creates a chilling effect on those working in academia, and the implications for sound science and the pursuit of free academic inquiry, I think, scarcely need underlying. I'll leave you a quote from Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa once said that without deviation from the norm, evolution is impossible. It's something worth bearing in mind. It's clearly true of evolution of species. I think it's also true of the evolution of ideas. Thank you.